Happy Earth Day. You might be wondering, what's so happy about our Earth right now? We're nowhere near containing global warming. Temperatures are certain to surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius. And now some countries, especially the wealthier ones, are beginning to question their climate commitments and actions. So what exactly is there to celebrate? I'd argue that we are actually in a better position today than we were 2 or 3 decades ago. We have a plan now. Yes, it's not perfect. There are still big challenges like financing, like feasibility. But the general roadmap is clearer than ever. And we've got the technical know-how to back it up. What we need are breakthroughs, either in technology that can scale quickly or in business models that make clean solutions affordable and accessible. And yes, some players are slowing down, but the fleet as a whole is moving, and is moving fast. I believe we are headed in the right direction as a species. But now there is this new variable in play. The United States isn't just slowing down its own climate efforts, it's also pushing back against others who are trying to move ahead. It's doubling down on drill baby drill, making fossil fuel deals with other countries, and using tariffs as leverage. And now even policies meant to support clean technologies are being paused or questioned. So, should we be pessimistic? Are tariffs just slowing down our global climate momentum? This is Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. And today I'm diving into these questions with Kyle Chan. Kyle is a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. His work focuses on industrial policy, clean technology, and infrastructure, particularly in China and India. He also writes the widely read newsletter High Capacity. Right now, we have a consensus that tariffs are definitely not a good thing for the global climate actions. But then I think we need like a more detailed picture about how exactly will tariffs have negative impacts on the global climate action. So I read your newsletter, High Capacity, which I think has the perfect perspective and also have the perfect numbers and also knowledges that's necessary for us to decipher what exactly is going on behind this. So first of all, let's do some maths. Yes, tariffs will have like negative impacts on the economy and also the climate actions. There could be some silver lining behind it. We're not sure. So can you first sort of analyze for us the good and bad sides of tariffs imposed by the US, especially in this round?
Yeah, so maybe it's easy to start with the bad because I think those sort of jump out to everyone. The bad part is that the US has been very important in fighting climate change, both in terms of reducing its own emissions, its own contributions to climate change, but also in terms of cooperation on technology, on production, on the broader sort of global supply chain that goes into renewable energy. So the US has played such an important role, and it's unfortunate that, not only before the tariffs was the US taking a different route on climate change and putting in the backseat, but that the tariffs really, I think, will make it much harder to do this sort of international cooperation, which I think is just so crucial. It's a global issue.
Yeah, and what about the good side?
Okay, the good side is the rest of the world, large parts of the rest of the world, many, many countries, not just China, not just the European Union, many parts of the global south are very, very keen on combating climate change, are very, very interested also in these clean technology industries that are emerging to help us make this transition to renewables. So despite the tariff walls that are being put up by the United States, it doesn't mean, in fact, far from the end of the global cooperation of climate change. It's definitely a bump in the road, but there's actually a chance for other actors to step up.
So seeing US is sort of shielding itself from the rest of the world using tariffs and other similar policies, it sort of provides a chance for other economies, especially in the global south, to step up. I know you specializes in industry studies, especially in clean tech industries. So do you have any specific or particular industries in mind which in your eyes have the best chance to grow facing this tariff war?
Yeah, there are still very interesting global supply chains, transnational supply chains, and areas of bilateral, multilateral cooperation. So one example is on solar. And it's not just a simple matter of, say, solar panels being made in China and being shipped out to Europe, but you actually have this broader supply chain where various aspects, for sure every country is deploying is part of that part of the supply chain. But you have, say, solar cells and modules maybe being assembled in India, coming from China, or you have solar manufacturing equipment that is coming from China and perhaps being used in other countries. So that's one area. Another is electric vehicles. That's not only really important for climate change, but it's a huge source of jobs. It's a huge source of economic activity. So here, of course, the devil's in the details, but you see areas of cooperation as well. For example, joint technology development on EV platforms. You see even the legacy automakers like Volkswagen and Toyota partnering with, say, Chinese EV makers to develop new platforms, whether it's with startups, or upstarts at this point like Xpeng, or sort of bigger players like BYD. And along with that, you also have this expansion of global production of some of these green goods, right? So again, moving away from a simplistic idea of, China manufactures all this stuff, exports to the rest of the world, and that's the end of the story. I think what we're seeing now is, and a lot of this is being sort of pulled by the countries themselves, but a lot of countries from Brazil to Indonesia to Thailand to Turkey and even parts of Europe are looking to bring in those investments to build these new plants, whether it's for electric vehicles, for solar, for batteries. They're looking to be part of this process, not just of receiving and deploying renewable energy, but of producing the parts and materials that go into it. So I think there's a lot of hope here, actually, that many of these partnerships, many of these kinds of cooperation will continue, if not even accelerate, despite or in the face of U.S. tariffs.
I spoke to an expert from Indonesia on energy transition and how these tariffs will mean for their country and also for ASEAN countries in general. He argued that right now in developing clean tech, it's not only about climate goals, it's not only about meeting your climate promises globally. They have these economic concerns to be, first of all, not left out in this new clean tech competition, and also to try to seeking what we call like high quality development or growth in different terms of different governments. But the gist is the same. You also mentioned in other reports, I think is the one with the South China Morning Post, that China will lead efforts in this clean energy, especially in Asia. Do you see that happening elsewhere in the world as well?
Yeah, I mentioned, like, for example, Brazil, where there's BYD plants for EVs and for solar and batteries. So there's actually a lot happening. And that relationship between Brazil and China, Brazil is trying to also spark a new sort of industrial revolution, bring back manufacturing and boost up its, so it actually aligns with a number of different political goals of Lula's administration in Brazil. Another interesting area is the European Union, which has been sort of insisting quite vocally that Chinese manufacturing investment, especially in EVs, entails some kind of technology transfer. And now that really made me stand up because, and I see that as a positive thing, because ultimately countries in the EU understand that the real value is unlocked from having some of the sort of more fundamental technologies rather than basic assembly. So they're looking to capture some of that, both in terms of wages for workers, but also sort of broader economic value. So I think that's another area where you can see perhaps broader technology cooperation, not just in sort of like transfer and sharing, but in terms of jointly developing, new battery chemistries. I think there's a global effort now to develop, say, solid state batteries or sodium batteries. So that's sort of exciting, and those are just from technology to jobs to new manufacturing plants. I think these are all areas that not just within Asia, but I think large parts of the world are very interested in.
Then coming back to today, that we are having different tariffs imposed from the US at different rates to different countries. And then there is a 90-day pause for the rest of the world, even though there, I think, it's still a 10% tariffs are still in place. Do you see these tariffs as sort of reshaping the global trade or global supply chain?
It could. The problem is right now, there is just uncertainty on top of uncertainty. The flipping back and forth, putting the tariffs on, taking them off, all the uncertainty over the tariffs. It's unclear even exactly what rate is going to be applied today, much less for tomorrow. And one of the big ways this affects global supply chains is a lot of companies, whether they are in, again, a lot of these renewable energy industries, from solar to EVs to batteries, are just not sure whether they should move production to, say, parts of Southeast Asia, whether those countries will get hit with very high tariffs. There's supposed to be ongoing negotiations, between Vietnam, I think, has a group that's negotiating. And the range could be anything. I mean, I would doubt that it would be as low as the 10% baseline. But if it was as high as I think some of the initial reciprocal tariffs, that would really throw a wrench into, say, Vietnam's, investment profile, their position in sort of broader global supply chains. So I think there's just a lot of hesitancy right now about how to act. It seems like a lot of businesses are sort of frozen, waiting to see what happens. And meanwhile, a lot of these, climate change is still a pressing problem, and that's not an issue that's waiting for anyone.
Yeah, exactly. And also I think in your newsletter you talked about right now trade is more than prices, but more about power. I think we are seeing it playing on the global stage right now. And what should countries like Vietnam or others who are sort of facing this uncertainty, but also having their climate goals and also economic goals in hand, what should they do?
Yeah, they're in a tough spot right now because they are integrating into supply chains connected to China for sure. And you have Chinese companies making huge investments in Vietnam, and this has been going on for a while, building off of a previous wave of investments from South Korea, especially, and other parts of Southeast Asia, a previous generation of investments from Japan. In many ways, this is not totally new. What is new, though, I think, is the ability of these countries then to export to other, especially developed markets like the US. Yeah, it will be tricky for them. I mean, if they're shut out from the US market, I'm sure that they'll try to find other places to export to.
Mm.
And there could even be some broader ex-US deal where, say, Southeast Asian countries work together with the European Union or even with countries in the Middle East. There's a lot of interest in, say, solar energy and battery storage capacity. So there could be opportunities outside the U.S. I think it just makes it very difficult right now to
Yeah.
figure out what to do next.
And also, US consumption definitely has a big share on the global level. It's very difficult to find a substitute that easy in a short term. Do you have a time frame, like for how long for businesses and countries that they have to endure this very painful and tough time?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it depends on one man. But yeah, because unfortunately, I am skeptical that it will end just after 90 days, even. So one problem is that not only has this sort of latest round of tariffs been put on and taken off, but it also is part of a longer term instability in trade policy where, for example, the US under the previous Trump administration had negotiated a trade deal, USMCA, with Canada and Mexico, in a manner that seemed to the liking of, the U.S. administration and U.S. national interest and all that stuff. And then this new Trump administration tore that up and threw new tariffs on basically the United States to of its largest trading partners. So that just adds another level of uncertainty. So then finally, after 90 days, let's say there are some negotiated agreements, how do we know that those will stick and that those won't get rewritten in a short period of time afterwards?
Exactly. So that's a big question mark in place, at least for this year. I'm not sure. But we'll definitely have to wait and see every day to see the new developments. And then I want to come back to China. China also have our own development goals, especially in clean tech, like in those industries that you mentioned in solar, in EVs, and in batteries. We have our own problems, and we also have our sort of advantages in this field. How do you see the future of the development in these industries facing with 140 something tariffs coming from the world's largest consumption market?
The ironic thing is China is actually in the best position, relatively speaking, to weather U.S. tariffs on clean energy goods because the U.S. already has essentially cut out China from a lot of these areas. So there have already been very, very strong U.S. protectionist measures that essentially block out a lot of, say, solar imports from China. Chinese EV makers have been very, very hesitant to make any kind of moves, even open up sales offices in the United States in anticipation of this very scenario. So in a way, for many of them, these tariffs and the broader sort of protectionist measures were baked in, were priced in into their strategies. I mean, they were looking, like for example, BYD was looking to a possible plant in Mexico, and there were questions about whether that was ultimately destined for export of EVs to the US market. But all this is just to say that actually the exposure of Chinese clean tech industries to the U.S. market in particular had been cut off. Now, there were some areas too. There are battery exports that are material, and those will be impacted very likely. Then there's a question, of course, of carve-outs. So now we've seen that possibly there are exemptions, although maybe not, on certain consumer electronics like smartphones.
Yeah.
And Americans sure love their iPhones and don't want to pay more for those. But there'll be questions about whether there might be carved outs for key components that go into American electric vehicles, for example. And again, there you might wonder whether a future strategy for the U.S. would be to allow the import of certain things, maybe even like batteries, but exclude other things. So overall, I see that actually, because China had been already sort of shut out to a large extent in some of these industries, it's suffering sort of the least shock, relatively speaking.
The biggest question's been sticking with me this whole time is that we're talking about the government of the world's largest economy. They sure would anticipate this happening. They sure would know that putting on tariffs on the rest of the world will have certain consequences on their domestic economy. And they still do it eventually. Why is that? And are they having this in mind that the tariffs will actually help their economic goals or political goals or whatever goals that they have?
I think that, to take a step back, I have to try to see this from the standpoint of an American who voted for Trump and why they did so and what they had hoped to get out of this. And so just to have some sort of like political context, right? I think part of the reason, if not the main reason, why Trump won, or the key reason why he won the election, was because of high prices of inflation. And that even though the US economy was doing strongly on paper, that unemployment was at record lows, that GDP growth was actually fairly robust, that all these indicators seem to say that the US economy was in a very healthy state, the subjective sense of people's sort of future outlook on their ability to afford basic things, that seemed to have tanked. And so the idea there, I think, for some Trump voters was that maybe this guy can turn things around, can lower inflation, and also maybe there was a hope that either that the Trump administration wouldn't be serious about tariffs, that they use it to negotiate a so-called fair trading regime,
Mhm.
or that they would go about implementing the tariffs in a more orderly manner that would bring back eventually American manufacturing jobs. So neither of those scenarios has played out, at least so far. So, I mean, negotiations are ongoing, so we'll see what happens with that. But certainly the orderly, structured, and sort of well-sequenced imposition of tariffs, that did not happen.
Mm.
Um, and, that backfired in terms of the ultimate goal of bringing back American manufacturing because you are making it much harder for American producers to get key inputs and in fact, it contributes to the very problem that American voters were so upset about, which is inflation. So I have a sense that there were expectations about what might happen. There were hopes for basically a better, stronger economy and more jobs as a result. And the reality has turned out to be just very, very different.
Well, that's interesting. As you mentioned, that some expected Trump to use tariffs as a negotiating tool, which he definitely had used, especially in his last term. You're not seeing it happening again this time. I would assume he's still using tariffs as a tool to gain leverages in negotiations. And he was definitely is trying to renegotiate every deal with every country right now. Or most country, I would say.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, the big problem is it's hard to tell when something has been planned out and there's a long-term goal and now the plan is sort of unfolding versus there was a rushed action, mistakes were made, actions were taken back, reverse course, try again. To a certain extent, it's a good thing to adapt, to respond to feedback, especially when you might be putting the U.S. economy, maybe the entire global economy, into recession. But I have a sense that Trump was very serious about these tariffs, not just as a negotiating tool, as so many had hoped, but that he really believed. And if you look back to his decades, writing from decades ago and interviews that he's given and speeches that he's given from years and years back, I mean, he has been very obsessed with tariffs as a tool for bringing back manufacturing and bringing back those types of jobs. So to a certain extent, I think he believes in them. And then I also think that the lesson that he learned from the first trade war with China was that tariffs were a win-win, that they were good for negotiation, but that ultimately they could bring in revenue, that they could bring back manufacturing jobs, that there was sort of no way the U.S. could lose. And unfortunately, I think that lesson, that he thinks he may have learned got applied now on a global scale, not just for China, but with this global trade war. So, we're all watching very carefully to see what will happen in these negotiations. But
Mm-hmm.
frankly, I don't think that was the original plan. I think he was serious about putting them on, and then he realized that he was about to break the American financial system, the bedrock of what gives the U.S. so much power in the world, which is its sort of financial superpower. Once you start to teeter on the edge, then I think that's what causes this change of action.
And now I think most economies are saying that tariffs won't bring back manufacturing jobs to the US. They won't serve the goals. Do you think he's realized that, or he was still willing to test the waters a little bit longer?
There's a very painful lesson that's being learned right now by a lot of Americans. I think it's unfortunate that we couldn't learn a little bit from history and to see the experiences of other countries because you would know quickly that it's a long process to either develop a manufacturing sector or to bring it back. And it's not as simple as just putting up tariffs. So whether you're talking about East Asian countries that were pursuing industrial policy, whether you're talking about even the European Union and Europe building an alternative to Boeing, creating Airbus, right? They didn't just put up tariffs or they didn't just shut out Boeing and hope that they could build their own planes from scratch. It was a very long, proactive process, carefully sequenced, thinking about where to strategically intervene, where to put tariffs, they could be very helpful if done in a careful and thoughtful way. All these other things that I think a lot of Americans don't realize would need to be done to bring back manufacturing jobs. You would need to do a huge amount of training, a huge amount of sort of education reform to prepare a workforce that is able to do these sorts of factory jobs, whether it's more technical or whether it's more, more manual. You would need to deal with aspects of permitting and licensing to make it easier to build factories and things like that. So, I can go on and on, but bringing back or building a manufacturing sector is not as simple as just blocking out everyone else's goods. And that's something that I wish more Americans realized.
Yeah, I think it took China decades actually to become a manufacturing power that it is today. But before we go, I do have this question about seeing tariffs imposed on the US and this uncertainty in the US economy, especially as the unhealthy structure that you just mentioned. Are you worried that the US will be left out in the key clean tech development, as we mentioned before?
To a certain extent, yes. And it's not just on, say, global supply chains, and it's not just on the circulation of, so-called green goods and things like that. I really worry at a more fundamental level about the limitations on the circulation of people and ideas and knowledge, because it's not just these tariffs. The current administration is clamping down on research in the United States, on universities, making life very difficult for basically anyone who's not a U.S. citizen in this country. There are many people who are frankly just very scared or very worried if they're on a visa or a green card even. And those people might not want to come and stay here in the U.S. and be part of, again, this sort of like global partnership of, research, investment, jointly developing, these clean energy technologies. And that would be a real shame. So I worry about the impact of all that, not just in terms of, the immediate economic impact, but the long-term consequences, that the long-term destruction that's sort of being wrought right now.
Yeah, in the past, US was the powerhouse for creative ideas in clean tech. I remember like the idea of sharing bikes was born in the US, in California, and also I think the EV, a lot of the key technologies was born at least in labs of the US. So in the future, do you see the US can continue to play as a role to be the brain for the, I would say, clean tech revolution that we are going through right now? Or what other roles will US play?
I know I sounded pessimistic with my last statement, but maybe it would help to end on a more optimistic note, because two things. One is that this current administration won't always be in power, at least if they continue to be, that's another story. So there are many, many Americans who believe strongly in fighting climate change, who believe very strongly in the kinds of jobs and economic growth that can come out of investment in clean energy. There are many states, local governments, from California to New York to Massachusetts, even the red states, actually, even the ones that vote Republican, many of them were the recipients of tax credits, subsidies, incentives to build, say, new battery plants in Georgia or in South Carolina. So there is actually still a lot of interest. It's not just that the federal government in the United States has put this whole priority on the back burner and let it go to waste. There are many, many, young entrepreneurs, scientists, researchers, activists who are still eager for the U.S. to play a role in this broader sort of global enterprise. So, yeah, in the end, I think it will make it more difficult for sure, and to especially lose the funding to even have these like bizarre bans, say, on wind energy. It's really counterproductive. But at the end of the day, there's still very strong demand globally and within the U.S. for progress in clean technology.
I get Kyle's concerns, especially given his academic background. There have been reports about researchers, not only just those of Chinese descent, choosing to return to or join institutions in China. But stepping back to the bigger picture of climate change, Kyle's concerns aren't unique. Take Tom Friedman, for example. He's the New York Times columnist. In a recent podcast, he said he believes climate change is one of the existential crises humanity faces. And to tackle it, the two superpowers, the United States and China, have to collaborate. He believed the global industrial ecosystem is also shifting. It's being shaped now by industries like batteries and EVs, not driven by coal, steel, or aluminum as it used to. Friedman said in that podcast, China is working very hard and very seriously to lead in these emerging industries. The US, though, not so much. Some people say Friedman's being naive here. What do you think? Well, you can tell me in the comment section below. A huge thank you to Kyle Chan of Princeton University for sharing his insights. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Climate Watch. If you have any questions about climate change or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out at fei.fei@cgteam.com. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform. Also, you can find me on Substack. I write a newsletter called Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.